Are we having an issue with sound?
No, we just have not started the meeting, Bill. Everybody's on mute until we start.
Thank you.
Paula was having some trouble with Zoom. She's trying to get in right now. And so I'm on the phone with her off and on, just as an update.
Okay, well, we could start the meeting. We do have a quorum, so we could start the meeting at any time, Jerry.
I think we're ready to start if you are.
Okay, I am. Let's call the meeting to order. Good morning, everyone. You're on mute, so you don't have to do anything.
Morning.
Good morning, David. We will do at this point a roll call, and let me do that for the boards of directors present. Director Perotti is having some issues getting in, so we will mark her as coming in a little bit later. Director McQuarrie. Chuck, you there?
I'm here.
Okay. And Dick Weinberg?
Yeah, I'm here.
Great. Bill Sheeler?
Here.
Dave Tabor?
Here.
And Chair Davis, I'm here. So we do have a quorum. Director Rodriguez will not join us this morning. She had a previous engagement she had to go to. And Director Perotti is working with our staff to basically get connected here at Zoom. So with that, let's go to the report regarding the posting of the agenda. Christina, quickly.
Yes, sir. I also have Director Perotti on the phone, so she can hear the meeting.
Okay, excellent.
Mhm.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Paula. Good morning.
Good morning.
The agenda was posted on Friday, May 29th, 2020 at MTD's administrative office, mailed and emailed to those on the agenda list and posted on MTD's website.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Takes us to the consent calendar. We have two items. Item 4, which is the approval of the prior minutes for the meeting of May 12th, 2020. And item 5, the cash reports for the periods April 25th through May 8th and May 9th through May 22nd, 2020. Are there any questions and comments on either of those two items? Raise your hand and we can recognize you. Bill, and then Dave. Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you, Chair. The one question I had was the payment for the Chevy Bolt vehicle. And I was just wondering how many vehicles were purchased and if that completely wrapped up the purchase of these vehicles.
Yeah, Director Sheeler, my recollection of that is the acquisition of 2 vehicles. It might be a third. I'd have to confirm that for you and get back to you. It does not wrap it. The entire order is for 10. So there still are additional vehicles pending delivery.
Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have it right in front of me right now, but it seemed like the payment was a pretty large amount for just a couple of vehicles.
I'll have to confirm it, but the total order is for 10. We've taken delivery of 3. We probably did make payment for all 10 as we made arrangements.
Okay, that makes sense then.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Director Tabor, Dave.
I was just noting on the second cash report that we've already done our third $1 million withdrawal from the LAIF account. We're 3 months into this emergency, and we've already at a pace of $1 million a month from our reducing our funds that we have on reserve. So just wanted to make that note.
Good. Thank you very much. Okay, and no other questions or comments on the consent calendar. I'm going to look for a motion to approve the consent calendar. Raise your hand and I'll recognize you. Dave,
Motion to approve.
is there a second? Is there a second? Okay, I got Chuck. Chuck is seconding it. Okay, so I'm going to do a roll call vote, and if you raise your hand and or unmute yourself when I get to you. Director Perotti? Christina?
Again?
Asking for Director, I got a yes from Director Prodi. Director McQuarrie, unmute yourself. He's a yes. Director Weinberg. Chuck, I can't, yeah. Director Weinberg,
Yes.
it's a yes. Director Sheeler,
Yes.
Director Tabor,
Yes.
and Director Davis votes yes. The consent calendar is unanimously approved. Thank you all for that. Concluding the consent calendar takes us to public comment. This is for items which the public may wish to speak that are not on today's agenda. Jerry, do we have any requests to speak under public comment?
I'm not aware of any requests to speak on this particular item.
Not hearing any on item 6, public comment, we will move into our next item, which is item 7. That is the operating and capital budget for fiscal year 2020 to 2021. Staff will recommend that the board adopt the operating and capital budget for fiscal year 2020 and 2021. Jerry, you want to begin, Mr. Estrada?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Chair Davis and members of the board. Just wanted to let you know, obviously with this operating capital budget, it's a unique situation. First, credit to our finance team. They've done a fantastic job getting us to this point. As you know, with the crisis, the numbers are, at best an estimate. I think it's clear. We're going to have to come back frequently to the board to share information and updates based on what's transpiring. So with that, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so what I'm going to cover at the beginning of the budget, then I'll hand it presentation, and then I'll hand it off to our controller, Mr. Davis, is the service level assumptions that are included, because that's really what drives our budget. And I'm going to first talk a little bit about the actions we've taken to date, what we've learned during this period about our service in this particular crisis, and what we've included in the budget. And then finally wrap up with the CARES Act funding and how that's really what's going to keep us going for the next couple of years. We're hoping, at least that's our goal. Next slide. So first item is service level. And what have we delivered? Since the crisis hit really in March, MTD's focus has been on providing service to essential workers, essential trips only, especially when we're in phase 1 and 2A in particular. So what we did was we prioritized the State Hollister corridor, the South County intercity service between Carpinteria and Santa Barbara, as well as typically what are traditionally the higher ridership lines. And I think that was the right decision. Many in our industry went right to weekends and just cut back to Saturday, Sunday service. We feel that we were able to provide a little bit better service for our essential workers going in this more strategic path. We also suspended, the first step was to suspend services that primarily served UCSB, Santa Barbara City College, and K through 12. And those are the lines 28 to 15X to 16 and our boosters. And then we followed that up with additional suspensions, which included all of our shuttle routes and the line 10 serving Cathedral Oaks. Next slide. So prioritization, as I mentioned, our focus was really on essential workers and maintaining that high frequency. That was really important because one of the other steps we took was limiting the maximum occupancy on board the vehicle to benefit our driver, trying to take care of them in this particular crisis, and the community that's riding the buses as well. The results essentially were that we suspended 8 of our 24 lines, and they're still suspended to this day. And the average weekday ridership initially dropped by 84%. As of last week, it was at about 77% on average, and we've seen it improving each week since March, through April and May. Each week we've seen improvement. Next slide. And here's the graph that kind of backs that up. And what you're looking at is 2 bars and a line graph. The first one, the blue bar, shows you total ridership from last year, and you see that 84%. Typically, MTD averaged about 25,000 rides in the first week of April last year. We had about 4,000. You see that line graph at the bottom this year as a result of the pandemic. The second bar or column there of 18,000 is an attempt to kind of normalize the data. We're looking at and say, well, those routes that we suspended, if you take them out of last year's equation, what was it? It was 18,000 rides. So when you're comparing the routes that are operating today versus those that operated last year, we saw 78%. What isn't shown here, we're trying to be fully transparent, show all the numbers, is student ridership. Last year at that time, we would have had a considerable amount of student ridership, UCSB, City College, K through 12, typically about 30% of our ridership. That still shows up in the prior year ridership figures and obviously is not in the current year numbers. And if you go down and you see where we were last week, excluding the holiday on Monday, we were about 5,500 rides for the week is what we averaged, which was, an improvement to 77% versus the prior year. And also that was really the first week where we increased the maximum occupancy on board the vehicles from 8 to 15. And I think we've seen the benefit of that. And one of the things I like to point out, looking at our statistics, we were trying to track every time we left someone behind, unfortunately, due to the occupancy limit. And those numbers decreased significantly last week. So that's some good news. Maybe we're at a good level at this point for this phase of the reopening. Next slide. Okay, so what's included in the budget? Service level assumption. In the budget, we're assuming a restoration of the lines 28, the boosters, 15X from Isla Vista to City College, and the 16, which is at City College to downtown. That's kind of the priority for us, looking at that. The challenges to restoring that service this fall. Workforce availability. I can tell you today, I'm not comfortable with the number of drivers we have to put all that service back on the street. We're going to probably have to hire some drivers to get to that point. There's also uncertainty regarding bell schedules and on-site instruction. We still don't know exactly how the schools are going to come back, at what capacity, and what that does for our service. So we're going to have to be very nimble this summer in preparing for essentially the unknown. But we are communicating with the schools. As soon as they know, I'm sure they're going to share that information with us, and we'll do the best we can to continue to serve the community. And of course, the maximum occupancy restriction will really become an issue again, I think, as the schools come back online. Next slide, please. Okay. What the budget excludes as far as service, it does not include restoration of any of the shuttle routes or line 10 serving Cathedral Oaks. The downtown Waterfront shuttle obviously is at the top of that list. I think it's public information. The city of Santa Barbara doesn't have the funding to help maintain their end of the agreement at this point. That's understandable under the current crisis. MTD was very fortunate. Public transit was a recipient of the CARES Act funds. The smaller cities were not. So we understand their position at this point. We've essentially paused that particular service, as said, suspended for the year. We look forward to the conversations with them about the future of State Street and what is the right service coming back at some point. So I think we're both, I don't want to speak for the city, but I believe we both are committed to serving downtown and doing everything we can for the community, and public transit is certainly going to play a vital role in that. The Seaside, the crosstown shuttles are going to have to continue to be suspended. If we're going to struggle just to have the workforce availability to do the other routes I mentioned, that's going to be difficult to bring back this year. The other issue, of course, are financial limitations. When you look at the CARES Act funding, I feel it's going to need to really last us 2 years, 24 months, because we're very dependent, and Mr. Davis will give you the details, on sales tax and fares. Right now, we've halted the collection of fares for health reasons. I think we're at a point where we could probably restore that. In the budget, we're assuming that doesn't happen until January 1st. It's a goal to do it much sooner if we can. I think the additional face coverings makes that possible. Many in our industry are still accepting fares. The over-the-road coaches, for example, still board from the front as well. So I think we're positioned and prepared to make that change at some point. We just need to decide when that's going to happen, and we'll come back to the board with more on that at a future date. Next slide. So that kind of segues into the CARES Act funding. As you can see in the budget that's been released, we're looking at about $8.5 million shortfall this year. We would be making drastic cuts beyond what you've seen already if it wasn't for the CARES Act funds that are available to us. And what we've prioritized is MTD service and the ADA paratransit service that complements it, that's operated by Easy Lift. So those are the priorities for the CARES Act in the Santa Barbara urbanized area. At least that's staff's recommendation. The goals is to attempt to make those funds last anywhere from 18 to 24 months so that we can see what the economic recovery looks like, give us some time. And then of course, the funding is limited to COVID-related capital expenses and operating. And there'll be more on this in a separate agenda item. We'll get more detailed on the CARES Act. And we will also have, we do have a request from SBCAG on behalf of the Clean Air Express for that. And that'll come up on agenda item 9, but we want, it is going to be a part of our budget at some point after we finish discussions. So really, next slide. That kind of concludes the overview of this budget and some of the challenges. And at this point, I'm going to hand it off to Mr. Davis to discuss the particulars of the budget.
You know
Mr.
what,
Davis?
Jerry, I could just make a suggestion to everybody, because I noticed this last time. There are 2 Mr. Davises. And so I would suggest we either hand it to Brad or Brad Davis. And then if it's to me, it's to Chair Davis. And again, for the public, it'll be pretty clear. So Brad Davis, Brad?
Well, good morning, Chair Davis and members of the board. I'm going to briefly review the budget today in basically the same format that I typically do. That is a quick overview, a macro view of the numbers that represent the deficits that we're projecting, and then go into a little bit more details on the revenues and expenses that explained those overall numbers. The emphasis will definitely be on the revenue side, and the expenses will be a fairly brief conversation, as other than the 11% cut in service hours that's embedded in the budget, there's not really a whole lot of change. And then I'll wrap up as usual with the capital budget, including both the projects that are included and the funds that will be available to support those projects. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an overview of the budget. Basically, the top table and the bottom chart say the same thing. The chart, I think, is a little bit easier to follow, fairly simple. The revenues are operating revenues in green with the operating expenses in yellow, and then the difference between the two, the deficit that's projected, is in the red. One number that does stand out, well, first of all, just in total, we're projecting an 8.6% budget deficit, with, of course, the vast majority of that being associated with reduced operating revenues. I did want to bring up all along those lines, if you look at the second column of the chart, which is the budget for the current year that's ending at the end of this month, you'll see we're seeing a full third drop in our operating revenue based on the assumptions that the General Manager Estrada spoke to a short while ago. And then also wanted to mention, we did, as mentioned 3 weeks ago, with the financial update, we have gone through the projections for the current fiscal year, actual outlays and revenues, and at this point we're projecting a $2.2 million deficit. Now, a reminder that embedded in that budget was a $500,000 deficit already. So we will be eligible for CARES Act funding between the two. So it would be about $1.7 million that we can make use of CARES Act funds to balance the budget. Next slide, please. Okay, here's the key budget assumptions. General Manager Estrada essentially went through them, but I'll just state them real briefly, as they are the key points that are embedded in the budget before you. And then the first one being that at this point we've scheduled no fare collection until the middle of our fiscal year, which would be starting in January of calendar year 2021. The same thing concerning contract fares. Of course, while we're not charging passengers to the bus, we do not expect to be charging any contract fare revenue for obvious reasons. Next, sales tax revenue, the second large component of our revenue reduction, which in the aggregate over the course of the year, we're expecting to be down about 19% compared to what's budgeted this year. Now, of course, I keep referring to what's budgeted this year is because that's the last, how shall I say, normal figures is the estimated figures for this year are, of course, significantly different due to the fourth quarter results. And then lastly, on the key points is, again, the service reduction of 11%. Next slide, please. Okay, here's our familiar operating revenue pie chart. The one item that really stands out here is the lower right corner, fare revenue, where it shows 5%. Obviously, that's reflective of the anticipated reduced fares and sales tax and other sources of income. In a typical year, that figure would be about 25%. Also wanted to mention that on the TDA sales tax and the dark blue on the right, and then the Measure A, 9% on the far left, typically when I talk about sales tax receipts, I'm talking about those two combined. So generally, I don't break them out in these overall discussions unless there's any specific need to do so. So as seen here, the sales tax contribution towards the budget this year is estimated to be 44%. Next slide, please. Here we have the three top sources of operating revenue for the district, being fares, sales tax revenue, and our federal operating assistance. Concerning fares, obviously the $1 million figure brings that bar way down. And I think it's really what's shown here. It really describes the $8.6 million shortfall included in the budget, and you can see that simply by looking at the far right, left section on fares. The difference between the first and the second column is about $6 million, and then when we look at the middle set of bar charts on the sales tax, we can see we're expecting this year to be down about $2.5 million from our typical sales tax revenue, and the addition of those two equals $8.6 million. So again, as we've stated before, that's where the crux of the matter is. And then on federal operating assistance, we are projecting a 2% increase from the level that was appropriated to MTD this fiscal year. Now, there's a lot of conjecture in that figure, and that's because this is the last year of the FAST Act, which is the 5-year transportation funding bill enacted by Congress a while ago. And there is no new funding bill in place right now, but we are making that assumption that we will receive approximately the same amount, because that is in fact what has happened for, going back at least a decade for the most part. Looking at sales tax a little bit more closely, what the assumptions we're using are that we are going to see MTD's revenue hit hardest in the payments received for June and July, and that's again because, as I mentioned 3 weeks ago, there is a lag time between when the state receives the sales tax funds and when they distribute them to public agencies. So I'm looking at March and April, and then May as being the worst of the months, and those represent the payments to MTD from May through July. Embedded in the budget is the assumption that is the bottom of the reduction in economic activity that generates sales tax revenue, and it was projected to increase after that, albeit not that quickly. I mean, it's all but certain we're going to be in a recession. We have sky high unemployment figures. Obviously, it's difficult to figure out how fast things are going to pick up, but based on our assumptions, when you put them all together, that leads to the expected 19% reduction in our sales tax revenue for the coming year. Next slide, please. Also just wanted to show our figure relative to the state of California, that is the sales tax number. And hopefully you can see this clearly. I think actually doing these Zoom meetings enables you to see the charts much larger, which should help. But in the highlighted section, basically it reads that they have reduced their initial budget in their budget revision issued 2 weeks ago. They revised that such the sales tax revenue is expected to drop by 17.3%. That's relatively close in line with MTD's projection. It's well within the expected margin of error, which is probably a lot greater than the 2% difference there. So again, depending upon what occurs in the economy and with the pandemic, it's hard to make these any accurate projections, and we'll coming back with a revised figure down the road. And next slide, please. Here are the familiar operating expense pie chart. There's not a lot to say here. Well, I always like to emphasize the point how wages and fringe benefits make up the vast majority of our operating expenses, as we are a service-oriented business with public transit, and it's the wages and benefits of our drivers and mechanics, et cetera, that enable us to put out our public transit service. Next slide, please. I do want to review some of the highlights of the operating budget. The first item I think I've talked about 3 times already, but it is the most important one affecting the operating budget, and that's the reduced revenue hours for next year. That also has a direct effect on other variable costs, such as fuel, cost of tires, bus parts, and other maintenance items. It also affects other administrative costs, such as liability insurance, as a portion of that is predicated on the miles traveled. So we will see a few other of our variable costs coming down in line with that 11% drop in the revenue service. One of the costs that will be going up, and has been up since March, is MTD outlays for personal protective equipment, and then the disinfecting of our buses as well as our facilities. At this point, that is costing us in the neighborhood of $15,000 to $20,000 a month. So, for a whole year, it's maybe is $250,000, which is with respect to the entire budget, not a huge amount, but it is definitely an additional cost to our operating budget that needs to be paid for. And then I'm not going to go into workers' comp as to the extent that we have in the past. I can suffice it to say that these costs and the estimated cost of current claims in the future vary considerably. As you recall, in the budget revision, we had to increase the allocation for workers' comp costs. Since that time, as mentioned 3 weeks ago, they're back to quote unquote normal. But last year they were down significantly. The year before that they were up. So this is just that variable in the budget that can really wreak havoc on the projected deficit or surplus. With respect to the employment assumptions, is what we usually do. We're just assuming full employment. That is pretty much the case for all the staff positions except for one. I believe we're at full strength on our utility mechanic ranks, and General Manager Estrada discussed the driver employment and levels. And while it's certainly a little bit less pressure, while we have many of our routes not providing service, that will pick up as our route activity goes, and as we are presently not hiring any drivers due to the pandemic. That completes my discussion on operating expenses. Could you go to the next slide, please? Okay, here's a breakdown of our capital projects proposed for the coming fiscal year. It's a $32.5 million budget, of which a huge portion of it is made up of actual bus acquisitions, as well as seen on the left side of the pie chart, the cost for refurbishing our existing fleet. Of the bus purchases, this includes the acquisition of 25 new buses. The majority of those are 40-foot diesel vehicles and 40-foot battery electric buses, with others including the previously discussed replacement of some of our smaller buses with light diesel buses, but their useful life will expire before the end of 2030, and the expectation is to replace those with electric buses. Also, bus refurbishing, again, this was in last year's budget. It's a carryover. It's simply, it's a major overhaul of the buses, including the replacement of the drivetrains, repainting to match our current color scheme, the replacement of passenger seats and the scratched windows, and just the floors, a major revamping so that they will really essentially look relatively new. And the reason that we need to do that is because we don't have the available funding at this point to cover the replacement of these buses at this time. Most of them are well beyond our 12-year useful life, but that's been typical. That's been our typical practice, is to run our buses for more like 12 to 17 years. As far as operating facilities, just wanted to mention in that 2.1 million are the funds, the TIRSUP funds received through the SBK grant with the state for the recommissioning of the overpass facility. Also, getting back to bus refurbishment, I wanted to mention that we do have a contingency of $500,000 built into that to reflect projects related to health safety, such as perhaps glass around the drivers to give them further protection from the COVID-19. And it also includes potential improvements to our facilities, with most of these improvements being related to trying to reduce the amount of contact between individuals. And the other fairly pro forma stuff in the remaining areas, so I won't get into those. If I go to the next slide, please. Okay, here is the capital funding that would support the proposed capital projects. As seen here, it's pretty obvious that our federal funds make up a huge part of that capital funding. And in fact, it's about 60%. And then the second column, our state transit assistance, which has been the mainstay of our operating budget that we've received year after year. That's going to be a big part of the budget as well. And with those two alone, it's I forget the math, but it's in the neighborhood, I think, of 90% of our covering our operating capital, our capital outlays for the proposed projects. What I did want to talk a little bit more about on these capital fundings is the federal assistance. So if you go to the next slide, please. The nature of the beast when for capital funding with the FTA, the Federal Transit Administration, and in addition, but less so with the state of California, is a lot of the funds are obtained on a competitive basis. MTD is competing with hundreds of other transit agencies for the same funding. The discretionary pending portion of the bar chart, which represents the majority of the federal funds that are included in the budget, are made up of 2 grants that we have submitted to the FTA for discretionary, from 2 discretionary pots of money that they have. We haven't heard back the results. I mean, in all honesty, it's pretty much hit or miss, with more misses than hits. The last time that we did receive a nice discretionary award was in 2017, and that's what covered the cost of the 10 Gilligs that were acquired last year, and we'll be paying for 4 of the 14 40-foot electric buses that are included in the budget. And the green sections represent what is definitely in hand for MTD. And let me rephrase that term, in hand. Actually, the only funds, if you go back a slide, please. The only funds that MTD actually has on hand are the UCSB funds, that's based on a sinking fund that's part of the local operating assistance they provide for the line 28 and the extension of the line 12X and 24X service. The remaining funds are held by the respective agencies that issue those funds. We normally get those after we have completed the capital project or as progress payments during the middle of those. So they're not on hand under MTD control and not showing on our balance sheet. Okay, if you move forward again. Actually, I pretty much completed my discussion on the discretionary funding. I guess to be realistic, it's quite likely that $32.5 million will be reduced under the assumption that we will not get all of the discretionary funding that we have applied for. Next slide, please. And the last thing I want to talk about is capital funding balances. That is all the funds that are available to MTD to pay for capital projects. The bars closest to the axis on the left is the state transit assistance. As I said, that's been a big part of our fund that we pretty much try to dedicate towards capital costs. And at this point in time, after the end of this fiscal year, we will have $8 million of those that are remaining available. And the same thing with the federal funds. We do have, that refers to those either discretionary funds that have previously been awarded or to our formula capital funds, which is it's different than the formula capital funds that we use for the operating budget. Just they're 5339A funds rather than 5307 funds. But the story here is that if all the projects in the budget are approved, then we will be reducing our unobligated balance down to the level that's shown in the teal, the lighter blue. So by year end, that would mean that we would have about $4 million in unobligated funds. Now, keep in mind that this is not a cash flow picture here. This has to do with whether the funds that we already have obligated to us are assigned for a capital project or not. So that means there's $4 million that is still not specifically, and they don't have a name on it yet for projects that are going to take place. And actually that concludes my presentation. And of course, happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great, thank you, Brad Davis. It was a good presentation, very thorough. We will first go to questions from the board, then to public comments, then back to the board for any comments before there's a motion. So let's start at the top. Any questions from the board? Raise your hand or unmute yourself and let me know. Okay, Chuck, you want to? Yeah, you're unmuted. You're ready to go.
Okay, looking at the board packet for the budget, I'm looking on page 2 about the restart of the UCSB Route 28, and I'm wondering clarification on when the Route 28 starts and when will the funding start from UCSB for that service? Are they tied together? That's one question. If we don't receive the funding to support the Route 28, and I guess the City College service as well. Will we operate those without receiving the funding? And then going over to page 6 on the capital projects, based on what I read in the papers, the city is being rather cautious about restarting the downtown waterfront service. And I'm wondering if they get to a point where they don't consider it feasible. We have the whole fleet of 30-foot electric shuttles, and I'm wondering what impact that would have on our capital budget with regard to buying some 30-foot buses. Would there be a need to purchase those buses in the event we have surplus shuttles? Because I think the shuttles have been designed to do regular service as well as shuttle service.
Mr. Estrada, yeah, and we'll go to Jerry on that particular question. Chuck, I'll come back if you have further questions. Jerry, you want to pick that one up?
I think the next question, I think Brad kind of hit on, is page 7 on the, where it speaks to federal funds. It says a large part of funding is reliant upon approval of 2 discretionary grants submitted to the FTA. And I guess the question is, when do we know? And I guess Brad has said, you know, it's kind of a by guess and by gosh. So those are my questions.
Okay, thank you very much. You want to mute yourself there, Chuck, and we'll go to Jerry.
Okay, Chair Davis, yes, thank you. I think I can handle all these questions. First of all, on the line 28, we did suspend that service. We notified UCSB of when we did that. Our agreement with UCSB, we negotiated a cash flow clause. So they actually give us advance payment each year. So we've had the funds for operation of the line 28 for the current fiscal year we're in. So actually, when we suspended it, we ended up having essentially a liability because we have a credit that we owe them for, which is one of the reasons why the shortfall in the fourth quarter increased recently. So we're sitting on that credit. We will talk to them about when they're going to reopen and to what level. Based on conversations we've had so far, perhaps, you know, it's going to be sometime in October when they reopen, but that's really a question that UCSB needs to answer. We're in discussions with them on that. But we will restart the line 28 at that point. The question we're discussing internally is what form that'll come in. Will we still need the 10-minute frequency? Should we come back with 30-minute or 15-minute? But then you have the maximum occupancy restrictions as well. And that's a very successful line with high ridership. So likely it would be the 10-minute. We need to make sure we have the workforce to handle it. The funding, I think we're fine. UCSB, hasn't wavered, but we are going to have discussions with them. And that's actually going to come up, and I'll address it in the next agenda item specifically. The 15X and the 16, which serve primarily UCSB or Santa Barbara City College, the community college does not provide MTD with any type of operating assistance for that. That particular service, MTD, board of directors will decide whether the service, survives long-term, but ultimately where City College does play a role in that is the student bus pass program. We do charge them, each student, a fee for transportation so they can ride any of our lines. But there's no requirement for service level or which routes we provide. That's really tied to when we start collecting fares again, because we're going to need those funds in order to restore these services without a question, in my opinion, for the long run. And then finally, on the downtown waterfront shuttle and the vehicles we purchase, I actually appreciate that question. Of the look, those vehicles were designed specifically for downtown Santa Barbara, and I think they were a wonderful addition to the community. But ultimately, they had served well beyond their useful life, and the manufacturer was no longer available to produce more of the vehicles. Honestly, MTD needed to move forward to more modern electric vehicles. It was clear to us, and this was a few years ago now, it's not a recent change, that the city couldn't make a long-term commitment to us at that point. That was prior to, I think, Measure C, to pay for that service. So what MTD had to do is make a decision, and we replaced them with 30-foot electric buses, which you see now, that are interchangeable. We can use them on regular service. Also, we purchased 8 of the 14 vehicles and leased 6. So the 6 can be returned if necessary, but that's not a decision we need to make now. We need to have conversations with the city to find out what the plans are long-term for downtown State Street, the waterfront. Things are changing. We're going to be a part of that. These vehicles, I do think, have a future, and I would probably prioritize them over running some of the old 29-foot diesels that we have now. But for now, we're just trying to kind of get through the situation. I think when we get closer to fall, we'll be able to address that more specifically. And then I think the last item, discretionary grants, I think Mr. Brad Davis covered that well. So I think that answers all the questions.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me? Yeah, I wasn't talking about the old shuttles. I was talking about the new 30-footers, and you answered that because that was my question was in the event the downtown waterfront service basically doesn't exist as it does now, we could use those in service on other transit routes, and I think they were designed for that. So I think you've answered that question. So
Good, good. Thank you, Chuck. You want to mute yourself, and then we'll go over to Dave Tabor. Dave?
Thank you, Chair Davis. The longer I sit here, the more my questions get answered. Maybe I just need to sit here a little bit longer. I had some questions about the shuttles too, and I guess the only one remaining is their cost of operation is less than our diesel fleet. Is there any sense in kind of switching them out at the current time since they're being stored in the yard at this point to save a nickel and a dime here and there?
I can take that question. Currently, we are operating the vehicles. We're using them in a way almost as relief vehicles at this point, because sometimes we're sending 2, 3, 4 drivers to the transit center from our facility here. So by using this vehicle, it's cost effective and it creates a space for them. So that's been helpful. But we're also identified other routes that we can use them on, and we'll probably be doing that soon. As far as the cost, as I think I've mentioned in prior board meetings, I think it's a little skewed at this point. We're still under warranty in many ways on those costs. So we haven't seen I think the full extent of that. Also, honestly, they are still first gen technology, and we're still having some issues at times, but the manufacturer has been supportive and we're working together to get through those. But for the most part, they're there and they're available to us, and we will use them as much as we can.
All right, thanks. Another question on page 11 of the operating expense summary. There's an item under route operations called transportation subsidies. Normally that's where we do the line item for the Easy Lift. It's a lot more than it would be for 12 months of Easy Lift subsidy.
Question for Brad, I think.
Wasn't expecting that number in there, Brad Davis.
What's different about that is that General Manager Strata talked about earlier is the support for the loss of revenues and increased expenses that Easy Lift is experiencing. We've received an estimate of what those costs are for next year, so we are including those in the budget in case they are needed as we need to, if we need to pass on CARES Act funding to Easy Lift to maintain their service.
Okay. The other one on page 9, the capital budget, there's a line item in there for the facilities master plan. We still have $50,000 there in the facilities master plan budget. Is that something we can use for our planning to upgrading other facilities in the future?
Yes, definitely. It's carryover funding. We did not spend the entire thing on the facilities master plan reports before you. In fact, we have them working on some additional things right now. And so we still have some money available under that contract should we need their services to assist us in other ways that are close to the facilities master plan, but slightly different.
Good. I expect we will. Okay, thank you, Brad. That's it.
Great. Okay, other questions from the board before we go to public comment?
Christina, I have a question.
Okay, go ahead, Paula.
Very good.
Okay, can you hear me? Couple questions on to follow up with Chuck on UCSB. Have we heard what other universities are doing for their fall fall enrollment, I heard a rumor, and it's just about a rumor, that the university is considering just taking back possibly freshmen, and because of and letting them live in the dorms because of the COVID-19 and the space and keeping social distancing. I don't know if anybody's heard about that before, but I guess my main question is about other universities. Do we think that they're possibly just waiting to see what other universities are going to do?
Jerry?
Yeah, the only thing I've heard about what other universities did is probably what you read in the press. Nothing specific through the industry regarding any of the other UCs in California. I think everyone is, like most businesses, is trying to figure this out. And I think there's a lot of ideas that are being thrown out there, and it's going to come down to for each each community to decide what's the best fit for them. But I think UCSB is going through that just like we did in cities. And I just don't have any specific information other than what we've seen in the media.
Paula, anything else?
Budget and looking at all the numbers and the possibilities. First of all, thank you, Jerry, and thank you to staff. The great report, and I know this is a moving target. Everything keeps changing. It's very fluid. But I'm wondering if we're making sure that we're looking at worst case scenarios, being very conservative when we're looking at these numbers.
Yeah,
Jerry?
yeah, I think Brad Davis did a great job with the sales tax. I mean, obviously, it's going to change over the next few months as we get more receipts, but he came in a little bit more conservative, I think, than the state was. As far as service planning, it's one of the things, what I want to emphasize at the beginning is that's our goal, is to restore those services. It's not a given that it'll happen. As we get through the summer and we see what the recovery looks like, the rate of it, and we figure out what we're going to be able to do with fares and at what rate ridership returns, because that affects the revenue obviously as well. That's going to determine, as well as workforce availability, how much of that service we can restore. And if our goal ultimately is 2 years, we're going to have to do that cautiously. And again, I'll be covering a little bit more on item number 9, CARES Act.
Thank you. Those are all my questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Chuck, you're raising your hand. You want to unmute and come back on?
Just a question that's not specifically related to the budget, but with all the changing schedules that we have and the rotation that we have on the drivers, how is operations and planning coordinating that with the drivers? Because typically they do their run cuts and they're set for a certain schedule for a period of time. And we're changing schedules all the time. So how are they handling the difficulty of an ever-changing schedule and getting the drivers set up so that they can go ahead and do pull-out?
Okay. Yeah,
Barry?
that operational question, it's a great question. Early on in the crisis, we obviously made an emergency suspension of services and then quickly reduced to spring break levels. So we had those, I mean, essentially by reducing, it was essentially spring break levels. We were able to get that in front of the drivers. We got them to bid the current work. And remember, it doesn't include the boosters, which really simplifies that, that work to be bid. So we did that and we told them there is no end date on it at this point. We're in the middle of the crisis. It's uncertain. So what they bid on was a couple of scenarios. They bid on one, the service you see on the street today. And then the other item they bid on was weekend only service if things got worse. If we started to have employees turning up, they couldn't report to work for whatever reason. And we just didn't have the workforce to deliver the service. So they've bid on those 2 scenarios already. Going forward, the biggest question for our planning team is, what are the schools going to do? And when are they going to do it? And so we are communicating, we're waiting to get the information like everyone else, and then we'll put something together for our employees so that they can bid the work going forward. So we are working with that, and we've worked with the union and they understand. I think it's just a situation we're in.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the board? Okay, I have a question for Brad Davis, just quickly, Brad. our revenue estimates, how do they compare to what the county and the South Coast cities are using in their budget at this time?
Well, with respect to the city of Santa Barbara, they are using, they made the decision to not revise their budget for the effects, the economic effects of the COVID pandemic. I saw that in their presentation about a month ago. And in fact, they're showing a slight increase in it. Now, they did include a table in their presentation that did indicate that they thought sales tax revenue would be down. And I believe the figure that they mentioned was about 13%, and it was based on a consultant study. As far as SBCAG has put out some different numbers for Measure A at this point. They have not done anything with respect to LTF, but the governor's proposal, the governor's revision in May did break down additional state funds that are flow through SBCAG, and they had varying degrees of change, with a lot of them not a high loss of revenue, as the funds were pretty much already selected this year for what's going to be used for next year. And then, as I said, the state was the other one that is.
Yeah, I got the state when you had that. What about the county of Santa Barbara? I looked at their budget online, and they are also showing an increase in their sales tax revenue for fiscal year 21. I've been trying to, I wanted to discuss that with somebody over there. I had not been able to get in touch with them as to the basis for that, but I'm making a guess that they're following the same strategy as the city of Santa Barbara. I'm probably a little different. See, the city of Santa Barbara has a 2-year budget, and they don't really come back and usually change it in the second year. So they have a 2-year budget. The county has 1-year budgets, and they usually make estimates. So yeah, it'd be worthwhile. Again, I'm comfortable with the projections you've made and the assumptions that you're making in this unknown world. But it would be worthwhile to go back and double check with where the county's going, especially with respect to simply the sales tax number.
No, I definitely agree. I'm really wondering how they came up with their figure.
Yeah. Okay, that concludes. If there are no other questions from the board, I want to see, Jerry, are there any public comments?
Yes, there is.
Okay.
It looks like it's Howard G.
Howard G. Okay, if you want to unmute Mr. Green and go to, I'm assuming it's Howard Green, by the way, and see if Mr. Green can be brought into the meeting. Howard, can you hear me?
Still working on.
Okay, go. Thank you, Brad, for the presentation while I'm waiting.
Okay, Mr. Green or Howard G, you should be available. You should be able to. My option was to make him a panelist and allow
There
him
he
to
is.
speak.
There you are. Good morning, Mr. Green.
It shows my mic as being both white and occasionally /red, but I think you can hear me now. I appreciate very much the need. I see Dave showing that I'm not audible.
No, you
Mr.
are
Tabor,
audible.
can you hear
No,
me?
you're good. Well,
Thank board members who asked about the Thank you, board members who ask about the electric fleet. I had those questions also. I have some different perspectives on what the city of Santa Barbara is doing budget-wise. I watch on channel 18, Cox Channel 18, the city budget departmental presentations, and they do show fairly significant cuts, I think in the nature of about 10% per department. Rob Dayton did absolutely declare when he presented a few days ago that the shuttles would not be resumed. And it sounded like he was saying ever, but I just want to share that there is visible cutbacks. The last question I would invite some dialogue on, if appropriate. Page 2 of the distributed materials with the packet has, I'm sorry, I need to flip to it. Discussion of business recovery plan guidelines in July. It sounds like it's going to be a very short summary, and I understand that these guidelines won't necessarily be complete and they may be dynamic, but I think that when this material is released, it should have contrasting information to what the current guideline is, not just what the proposed guideline is. Now, you do that in the budgets. You show the past and the future. The only other comment I would make is it was fairly hard to track on Mr. Brad Davis's presentation between the printed charts and the charts on the PowerPoint. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Green, for your comments. And again, I'll just comment back to Mr. Brad Davis and to Jerry Estrada. Checking with the city and the county as we go forward, because everything is fluid and they're going into their adoption process in this next month. I have also watched the city presentations, and one of the reasons I asked the question is because they are presenting information talking about the degree of cutback, especially in sales tax. To watch those things, and again, we're in a fluid situation, to report back to us what their assumptions were, how they match up as we go forward. We are, as Mr. Estrada, I think in the very introduction talked about, we'll be looking at changes over the year, reacting to the actualities of what we're seeing. So thank you for your comments, Mr. Green. That takes us to then to any board comments, and then we'll be looking for a motion and a second to adopt the proposed budget for fiscal year 2021. So, okay, Bill Sheeler. Bill, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I hope you can hear me. I really didn't have any questions, so it's just comments, just things that I wanted to share with everybody, just thoughts that I have about this. I just got a list, so I'll just go through the list. It looks to me as that the full sanitizing costs will need to be part of future budgets. That will just sort of be a concrete lockdown for the confidence of our riders. I've heard some discussion, and these are mostly in larger municipalities, of no longer collecting fares and just having full subsidies in order to prioritize alternative transportation. And this is kind of the path leading in that direction if it were to ever go that way. I also note, but looking at our daily ridership numbers and how they're coming forward, it just shows how many really essential riders there were embedded in the community once you strip out some certain other elements of our demographic. I really want to congratulate MTD for making that change a number of riders and leaving fewer riders behind, if any. I think that's a great response. And then the thing that I really don't understand, and maybe the finance committee will understand this better and be able to share it, but I always understood the embedded in the budget assumptions was a full employment assumption. And as we all know, in any organization this large, there's never really full employment. There's always some savings. And I can understand that happening when we had a full workforce, but now that there's real issues of workforce availability now and going into the future, I'm not really understanding why a full employment assumption makes sense. The other thing that I don't understand, and maybe it's just because of embedded costs, but we're talking about our operating costs are going to be decreasing by 4%, yet we're going to have 11% fewer revenue hours. And I realize that's not a one-to-one relationship, but I just wanted to point those things out. Thanks.
Good, thank you for your comments. Okay, are there any other comments from the board at this point on the budget? Dave Tabor?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was glad to see a line in there about the regular budget revisions. I think that's the only way to go forward. I don't know if we need to schedule them regularly, but I'm sure almost every time we sit down from now on, we're going to be hearing on something on this and probably adjusting the numbers as we need to go along. I think nimble was the word our director used, and I think that we're going to be using that word a lot more here in the coming fiscal year. I like to push us to get to the collecting affairs. I kind of think I have a pretty good idea what it's going to take to get us there. It's going to be tricky because that space is not easy to deal with. That the bus drivers are left with up in the corner there. But I'm hearing from my friends and the people in the public that they're I wouldn't say upset, but they just scratch their heads that we're not collecting fares. So I think the more we can get, and the sooner we can get going in that direction, the better off we're going to be. And it's $150,000 by the end of the year, just with the 5,000 riders we're getting now. And I don't like being reactive. And I think every chance we have here in the coming months to kind of slide over into that proactive stage, for me, I'm kind of asking myself, what do I want to happen rather than what do I expect to happen? So I think that's the approach I'm going to be taking, trying to figure out what I want to happen. And then next question is, how can we make that happen? So I urge you all to kind of move along those lines and get us where we want to be. Thanks.
Good, thank you very much. Other comments? I will save mine until everyone else has talked. If I do have a comment, just reacting to what you said there, Dave, regarding collecting of fees. I know that I have personally basically stressed the protection of our employees first, because in fact, if our employees go down, then we don't even put service out. And the non-collection of fees and coming through the rear door in a unknown situation that we have, like with this virus, has been very important to protect our employees in order to provide the service to those in the community who are essential riders. So I think staff has done a really good job of being proactive, just as you talked about in that regard. And I know that in the budget, and they're moving forward with protection to the drivers in order to, again, get front loading where we can collect fees. And the other issue is going to happen there too, is the whole question of exchange of the dollars in the fees. That puts more contact into the system for the people collecting the fees. And so we still need, I think, to be very, very careful. But I think staff is, as you say, trying to be proactive in addressing those things in that regard. So Jerry, you wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to reassure the board and the public that I'm planning on bringing back an agenda item in July that focuses on service restoration and a number of things we're talking about now beyond just the budget. So it is more of a proactive. It also shares some of the things we've learned and how we would adapt if we had to go backwards. So it's really focused on the reopening plans and how we're going to adapt and mirror that process.
Excellent. Mr. Chuck McQuarrie.
Just a question on the new 30-foot shuttles. Aren't the fare boxes by the rear door?
Yes, they
Just a
are.
question.
Yes.
Yep.
So that
Those are done.
cuts down some of the risk anyway.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, so we've completed board comments. So I am looking for a motion to adopt the proposed budget for the fiscal year 2021. Is there raise your hand for a motion? Chuck, you want to go unmute yourself and make the motion? Okay, you got to still unmute yourself, or Jerry.
Okay, I move for approval.
Okay, do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, seconded by, hey, you want to let Paula in there, Dave?
Sure.
Okay, seconded by Director Perotti. I will do a roll call vote. We'll start at the top again. Director Perotti.
Aye.
Yes. Director McQuarrie. We got to, for the record, Jack, unmute yourself and you're still muted. Oh, there you go. Go. Bill, you want to mute yourself? Yeah, hang on, Bill. You got a lot of static. Okay, I'm going to let the record show that Chuck raised his hand, and Director Weinberg. Raise your hand, Chuck, Dick. Okay, let the record show that Director Weinberg raised his hand as a yes. Director Sheeler.
Yes.
Thank you. Director Tabor.
Yes.
Okay, Director Davis votes yes. The budget is adopted unanimously. Thank you, staff, Jerry and Brad, and everybody who worked on the budget with you. And thank you, board, for your insightful comments for this item. Okay, our next item, item 8, this is an amendment to the declaration of fiscal and public health emergency due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're requesting that the board of directors amend the resolution 2020-03 to add negotiation of agreements to existing transit service, renewable diesel fuel, fare buy down, past program agreements as needed. General Manager Estrada, Jerry, you want to go make this presentation?
Yeah, yeah, I'll be quick. I mean, obviously, what we're trying to do here is be as transparent as we can be. When we did the declaration in March, we've had to make, executive decisions and get things done as quickly as possible. And I appreciate the support of the full board. But we also want to make sure the public's aware of what we're doing. And we've been trying to provide as much information as possible. And I felt after consulting with Chair Davis that this tweak to the amendment so that the public knows we are working on a number of our agreements, everything from the downtown Waterfront Shuttle, the Line 28, potentially our student bus pass programs with UCSB and City College, advertising contracts, and diesel fuel, which expires in November. So there's a lot going on, things that we would typically come back maybe and go through a different process. So we want to make sure we're being clear about what we're doing and make sure everyone knows it. So I think it's a minor tweak for really transparency purposes.
Okay, you've all seen the change in the resolution. Are there any questions from the board before I go to public comment? Bill?
Thank you, Chair. I think I have 3 questions. Number 1, does this amendment expire? And number 2, how does this become rescinded if that would to be the choice of the board? Who would bring that forward? And how will these negotiations being done by the general manager or his designee or the chair of the finance committee or the chair of the board be shared with the full board? Thank you.
Mr. Estrada?
Yeah, I think first of all, the amendment can be lifted by action of the board at any time. So if you want a specific date, you're welcome to ask for that amendment. If that's what you want to do. I think it's clear that nobody knows for certain how long this pandemic is going to go along. So at any board meeting, you could reverse it. As far as how we're going to go about this process, really all I'm asking for is access to the finance chair as well as the board chair for consultation purposes on all these agreements. And then before I sign anything, it's going to come back to the board. Unless there's some kind of emergency need here, I don't think there is. I think all of these can come back to the board, but I just wanted to be transparent with the public that I'm not just doing this alone and that I'm consulting with the board and the finance chair. I hope that answers the questions.
Yeah, and I think just to make a note, you're also going to report out at every board meeting any actions which were taken in the previous period to publicly disclose those. And obviously, if the board had an issue, we would place that then on the agenda for further consideration.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. Any other questions at this particular point on the resolution? Jerry, do we have anyone from the public who wishes to speak on this item?
I don't see any hands raised.
Okay, excellent. Okay, we're now to comment and or a motion in a second. I think we didn't have many questions, so I'm assuming we don't have too many comments. So this is a resolution basically to amend the emergency resolution we previously adopted to give Jerry the ability to consult with the finance chair and the board chair on these particular agreements and contracts which may come up during this pandemic period. Is there a motion to approve or to adopt the resolution? Okay, raise your hand.
I'll make that motion, Mr. Chair.
Okay, I have a motion from Director Tabor. Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, Director Parodi has seconded the motion. Okay, and again, a roll call vote. I will start again at the top. Director Parodi,
Aye.
yes. Director McQuarrie,
Yes.
Director Weinberg,
Yes.
Director Sheeler,
Yes.
Director Tabor.
Aye.
Chair Davis votes yes. The resolution is adopted by a unanimous vote. Thank you all very much, and it will move us right along to the next item. Next item on our agenda is shown on the screen there, item 9. This is the CARES Act Transit Funds Program of Projects. Staff is recommending that the board approve MTD's program of projects, which in this particular case apportions the funds to operations to MTD, and there may be sub-recipients later on, but at the present time it is taking the CARE Act funds that we have here and appropriating them over the next few years to deal with shortfalls in our budget. And so I think Mr. Estrada will explain that a little bit further. Mr. Estrada, Jerry, you want to cover that?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to hand off the first slide of the presentation to Mr. Moss, our Grants and Compliance Manager. So Steve, you're up.
Good morning, Steve. Steve, you're muted. You're no longer muted. Good morning.
Good morning, Chair Davis, and members of the board. So as you may recall, on a usual occasion, we have a program of projects for our regular 5307 operations funding. And that's an annual event, which is tied to our service plan adoption for the year. And in that case, for those 5307 funds, we have a more structured process than what the FTA is requiring for the CARES Act. As in many cases with the CARES Act funds, FTA has reduced the obligations to make it easy and quick for agencies to get this money out and keep service operating. So for our program of projects for the CARES Act, we have 2 requirements. One is to make available to the public information on the amount available, which is in the staff report. And 2 is to make the final program of projects available to the public. And that's our only requirements for this process. Our program of projects for this funds is to use the funds to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, also known as the coronavirus. And I apologize, I probably didn't make that quite clear in my staff report that was actually the program of projects, but that is what it is. That's our recommendation. So again, the process is just simply to make the amount available to the public and to make the final program of projects available, which if the recommendation is that the board, in fact, vote to do that. As Jerry discussed, we expect to spread the funds over at least 2 fiscal years. And hopefully that'll be sufficient to get us back to a more normal operational situation. Now, the one unknown at this point is that SBCAG, as I understand, is requesting some CARES Act funding from the three FTA recipients in the county, which is MTD, City of Santa Maria, and the City of Lompoc. They've requested a total of 1.2 million, and if that's divided by thirds, we'd be making them a subrecipient for 400,000 of our funds potentially. Now, if that is the case, we will have to actually execute a subrecipient agreement with SBCAG. We've got a sample one that the City of Santa Maria has used when they have over the last several years made some of their 5307 funds available to SLO counties, to the SLO County Regional Transportation Association. And we've looked at that and we'll likely revise that agreement to work in our case if in fact we do end up making SBCAG a subrecipient. And so that's pretty much it for my slide. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
I made a comment to General Manager Estrada yesterday. The action essentially says approve a program of projects, which for public consumption usually means a list of things to do. But in fact, what the program of projects at this point, what we're really asking in the approval of this item is to appropriate the money for operating assistance. And we are anticipating through the budget process to spread that over a few years and to consider any sub-recipients applications which we may receive for use of that for operating assistance. Is that correct, Steve?
That is, the only addition I would make to that is that it specifically is to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the pandemic.
Excellent, thank you. That's a great addition, adjunct to the question to make it very, very clear. So, go
Chair
ahead,
Davis,
Mr. Estrada.
I do have a few more slides on this.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I just wanted to interrupt because I wanted to make sure that I was understanding correctly the recommendation in that regard. Thank you. Go ahead, Jerry.
Sure, next slide. Okay, you saw the slide earlier in the budget, so I'll go through it quickly. Again, it's just a reminder of what we've prioritized, and we want to make sure, again, we're transparent about how we're doing so. It's about MTDs and Easy Lift's public transit operations on the South County, the ADA paratransit service that Easy Lift runs. The goals we've discussed, we just clearly identified what the funds are for, and SBK requests. Next slide. Okay, I wanted to show you kind of taking the budget and give you an idea of what the shortfall looks like. So for MTD and Easy Lift, for the current fiscal year, we have a shortfall, at least a projected shortfall, about 2.2 million. For the budget that you just approved, it's 9.7 million. That includes some assumptions on capital, about 800,000, everything from driver barriers to potentially contactless type of payment process. And they're just placeholders, as setting something aside. And when you look at our operating budget of 29 million, you end up with about 33% of the budget for this particular year is being covered with CARES, operating capital. We also looked at the Clean Air Express, the 1.2 million, which would hopefully be divided 3 ways among the grantees. All that still needs to be worked out, but I'm optimistic. I pulled their operating budget from the single audit. It's about 68% of that. Now, it could be that they're heavy in capital. We'll talk to them and figure out what specifically the 1.2 million. My guess is it was a placeholder. And as we get into the details, we'll figure out what the actual amount is. Next slide. And this is the last slide. I wanted to show you a fund balance projection. I thought it was really important for the board and the community and SBCAG and everyone else to see it in context, what MTD's, Easy Lifts, and the Clean Air Express request look like. So with the CARES Act funding of 16.3, nearly 4 million awarded, and you back out the expenses or the shortfall for this current year, you project an ending balance of 14.1 million. You carry that over by the end of this coming fiscal year. If we hit our budget numbers, obviously it's going to change. You're at about 4.4 million. At 4.4 million for that second year, that doesn't get you all the way there based on the current configuration of our service levels, et cetera. It gets you maybe to that 18-month point. And I think this was the important issue here. We're going to have to take some actions in this coming year. We'd be careful with service levels. I agree we need to get back to collecting fares once I think the face coverings that are required now on board the buses give us that opportunity to do so. Those are critical steps that we'll need to take to make these funds potentially go through the second year. So if the SBCAG request is a third, it'd be 400,000. As you see, as a percentage of the budget, I think that's a little high. I want to talk to them about that. However, if it's for the full period through June 30th, 2022, then it's right in line with MTD's estimates. So I'm optimistic we'll be able to work something out. I do think we need to look at all, as a grantee for the Santa Barbara urbanized area, we do need to consider this. And, I think there should be an award. And I think if it's for the entire period, it'll be right in line with our estimates and we'll be treating them the same. I should also point out that Easy Lift's request for this year, or estimate for CARES funding, was about 17% of their operating budget. So we really appreciate Mr. Paredes and his staff and how hard they're working to provide the service and do so in an efficient fashion. So I just wanted to provide some context to the discussions we'll be having. Any questions, happy to answer them.
Thank you. Good presentation. I think Bill has a question and then I'll go to Chuck. Bill first.
Thank you, Chair. Maybe I'm a little dense on this, so the questions may have already been answered, but I appreciate you giving it another shot here. First of all, I'll ask, what are MTD's program of projects? Is there a list or something, or is this something I should be aware of?
It's our entire operating budget, essentially,
Yeah,
plus any
Jerry,
capital expenditures related to COVID.
Yeah, Jerry, if I could just interrupt, Bill, I asked the question and I tried to clarify it twice. We use a term here, and I clarified this with General Manager Australia. The program of project is a term of art for this particular grant, or the CARES Act grant. But in fact, what we're doing is appropriating the entire amount essentially to the budget for operating assistance. So it is essentially our bottom line operating assistance budget to cover everything. And again, it's on a reimbursement basis. So it's not like a capital projects of A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3. It's essentially appropriating the entire amount to operating, and as Jerry has indicated in the presentation, to be split over at least a 2-year period of time, and to be at that period of time might also basically then be looking at sub-grants that basically we would give out through applications from other agencies like SBCAG. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. And it leads into my next question. How much of the potential fiscal year 2021 operating deficit does the CARE Act ameliorate?
Jerry?
We're assuming it's going to offset all of it.
Great. Okay. What happens to the CARES funds and that's our budget deficit when we start to reinstate fares and contracts with other entities and our revenues start to increase?
Well, assuming our revenues increase at a rate greater than our expenses and the budgeted shortfall decreases, those funds will remain available in the U.S. Treasury for us to draw down for this in the second year. Again, I want to emphasize, I think what Mr. Brad Davis also highlighted in his budget presentation, we don't know how slow this recovery is going to be and how long it's going to take. So we really are trying to assume 2 years with the CARES Act funds.
Thank you.
Okay. Chuck McCory, unmute yourself and you're still muted, Chuck. There you go. There you go. You're on.
Okay, my question is in regards to agenda item 9, the very last sentence. Any CARES Act funding provided to SBCAG for the Clean Air Express would require each FTA recipient to develop a sub-recipient agreement with SBCAG. I've never seen us involved in any budgeting for the Clean Air Express. So I guess just clarification as to what that sentence means.
Okay. What it means is in order to pass federal funds to another transit operator, and in this case, SBCAG's wearing the hat of the transit operator responsible for the Clean Air Express. So in order to pass those funds through, we need a subrecipient agreement where they sign off on all of the requirements that the FTA has for these funds, because ultimately MTD is responsible. You know, our experience has been with the Federal Transit Administration is they're looking to us as the grantee to make sure all rules are followed, period. And if a subrecipient isn't following the rules, it's going to be on us. So we need to make sure we have an agreement with anyone, regardless of which agency it is, if we're passing funds through. And it'll be the same way for the other grantees, Santa Maria or Lompoc.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions from people? Mr. Tabor, Dave Tabor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have a potential for some cash flow issues here. Is there any idea of what the timing of the receipt of these funds is going to be?
Yeah, great question. Currently, we've submitted the grant for CARES. They've asked, the FTA has asked for some additional language to be put in there, but we're not anticipating that being a problem. I'm hopeful that the funds will be available in the next 30 days to us, at which point we'll look at the fourth quarter. We'll probably do a drawdown based on our financials for the fourth quarter. And then going forward, I mean, my thinking is we'll look at it quarterly to protect our reserves, but we're going to be following closely what the industry is doing and what FTA guidance is being given to other agencies. It's still a little unclear, on that. So we'll adapt as we have to, but we're not going to wait till the end of the year. Or honestly, yes, you're correct. We'd have a major cash flow issue.
Bill, you want to go back to Bill? Bill, you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, as a result of this conversation, it did seem different. I guess usually I'm used to SBCAG passing through monies.
Yeah.
Never really been sure exactly how that works. So my question now that kind of the roles are reversed, does MTD receive any sort of administrative overhead for the costs associated with securing contracts and for passing through these funds? Do other agencies do the same thing? And if so, does MTD as well? Thank you.
Well, yeah, I can't tell you for sure. We haven't done that a lot. I do think some agencies perhaps have charged an administrative fee. In this particular case, we'd just be pulling CARES funds from our own operating budget if we did charge an administrative fee. The FTA isn't going to give us any additional money other than what's there in the CARES Act. So I think, we'll work that out. And, at this point, it's an emergency. And the Clean Air Express is an important service in Santa Barbara County, connecting north and south commuter service. And I think, I feel we have an obligation to step up as the grantee for Santa Barbara urbanized areas. So I do support something. I just want to make sure it's equivalent to what we're doing and the other, and consistent with our numbers as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There's a set amount of the CARES dollars. So if we drew down for administration, it would simply be less money available for other operations for MTD. Correct?
Correct.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, there is a request, a recommendation that we approve the CARES Act funding for a program of projects, which essentially indicates that we'll be appropriating that for operating assistance. Jerry, Dave?
I wanted to ask the director if we had any public comment.
Oh,
yes.
Thank you. Good point. Jumping right over there. Jerry, public comment.
Let's start with the written comment from Executive Director Kern of SBCAG. Christina, if you could read that into the record.
So we received an email on Monday, June 1st from Executive Director Kern. And she says, I would like to thank the SB MTD board and the general manager, Jerry Estrada, for your consideration for the request to use the CARES funding for the Clean Air Express Transit Service. As you know, Clean Air Express is not a designated federal transit recipient and therefore did not receive any CARES funding directly. SBCAG staff has asked each of the federal designated transit recipients in Santa Barbara County to consider an allocation of CARES funding to the Clean Air Express service, as we are all impacted by the COVID-19 related reductions in ridership and service. The openness and willingness to consider this request is greatly appreciated. Margie Kern, SBCAG Executive Director.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Dave and Jerry, for catching that on process-wise. Jerry, other public comment?
Yes, Howard G. Would you like me to make him available?
Please, you want to unmute Mr. Green and we'll go back to seeing if we can connect with him.
The
Go ahead, Mr. Green. We can hear you.
Thank you. The slides are more complete than the one page in the packet. I see the goals in the first paragraph, but I think the spirit of the federal legislation is to give us more details. Now, I do understand that you're using it for operating expense, and that's been detailed elsewhere, but I think somewhere in what you approve, you should say that. I don't think it says it. I think it says the relationship with SB-CAG and the Express, Clean Air Express, but I don't think it talks about the rest of the money. And I think this needs to reflect that. Certainly the dialogue here does, but in terms of the written materials. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green, for your comment. Okay, which again, I will restate the motion as I understand what staff is recommending. That is to approve MTD's program of projects for the use of the CARES Act funding. And in the recommendation here, the program of projects is directed to operating assistance to pay for increased expenditure and revenue losses resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. That money would be appropriated through MTD. It would go into the use of our operating and possibly our capital budget, as well as we could consider any applications we receive for FTA recipients to develop sub-recipient agreements in the future to use portions of that money for transit within our district area. Jerry, is that capture it?
I believe it does.
Okay, so we will be looking, I'm looking for a motion to approve that. Is a motion? Is there a motion to approve that recommendation? Dave?
I'd make that motion, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Bill Sheeler Director Sheeler has seconded that. This is a recommendation on the motion. Director Perotti.
Aye.
Director McQuarrie.
Yes.
Director Weinberg.
Yes.
Director Sheeler.
Yes.
Director Tabor.
Yes.
Chair Davis votes yes. That motion is approved unanimously. Thank you, staff. Thank you, board members, for your questions on the item. I think it helped clarify exactly what is going on. Okay, it takes us then to the next item on the agenda, which is item 10, the general manager's report. Mr. Estrada.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I mean, the written report is there. Wanted to highlight a couple items. We did receive a number of responses on our A&E services for on-call A&E services. One of the primary projects would be the Terminal 2 recommissioning. So we're excited about that response. It's going to take a little while for staff to get through that. Optimistic that we can hopefully bring that back to you in July. Also, the youth art poster contest, our marketing team figured out a way to get that done in this environment, and that's exciting, and we're looking forward to seeing the results of that as we do every year. That kind of concludes the items I wanted to touch on in the GM report. Happy to answer any questions.
I believe Mr. Davis stepped out. Chuck, you're unmuted. Have a question? Nope. I think the only question I had earlier was answered earlier. I noticed in the previous couple of general managers reports, we hadn't listed any names of new hires for buses. So I guess that's been suspended for a while. We just haven't had any applicants.
I'm sorry, you referred to which position?
Bus driver.
Oh, the challenge we were in, obviously, we are looking for bus drivers. The challenge, and I think we have had applicants at this point. I talked to HR, but I believe we do. The challenge we have is in licensing. It's one thing to bring somebody in, get them trained, but we need the DMV offices to be not only open, but ready to take appointments to approve the licensing. So that's kind of where we have a holding or a problem getting it processed. Once that's cleared up, and then we'll be able to get aggressive on that front. But again, we got to be straight with people and honest about our situation. The CARES Act funding is going to help us through the next year, and hopefully the second year. But beyond that, we'll see. We'll need that recover, the economy to recovery, and fares as well. In other words, ridership.
I was going to say it's hard to foretell, but this could be either really good or really bad for the pool of potential drivers.
Okay, thank you very much, Jerry. That takes us then to item 11, other business and reports. I will report that the Cairo Ad Hoc Committee did hold a meeting where we talked, we were brought up to date on the status of the negotiations with the proposed developer for the property. We gave some instructions back to our negotiating team. We should hear back within the next 60 to 90 days, and we'll report back to the full board on its status at that point in time. Any other board or committee reports or any other items that you wish to raise at this time? Bill, Director Sheeler.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a couple comments that I wanted to close with. One of them to do with, it's great to see the transition to electric vehicles in our fleet, and just looking into the future when we'll be big time charging our electric vehicles, and the fact that our community has embraced community choice energy, and the fact that we actually have two different providers, the city of Santa Barbara, and as it turns out, it will also be, I guess, if this is in the city of Goleta. And so there could be differing costs in each of those jurisdictions with the cost of the electricity that we use based on the time of use. Something to look forward to, actually a good thing. And then the last thing I just want to mention, Taylor talked about being reactive or proactive. And there is proof that you can attain progress even during a crisis. And one example of that was in 1863, during the middle of the Civil War, the federal government began construction of the Transcontinental Railroad.
Good history there. Thank you, Bill. Okay, no other things under item 11. And we'll move us towards adjournment. I do want to talk about the fact of our next meeting. General Manager Estrada and I have discussed, and we would be proposing to cancel the next meeting in June so that our next meeting like this would be the first week of July. Any comments from board members on doing that at this point in time? Otherwise, we'll ask Jerry to go ahead and move forward with canceling the next June meeting and looking at July. Jerry.
Yeah, it will be critical if we cancel the last week in June, as we discussed, that we have that meeting on June 7th, it's looking like. So we may have an item we have to bring to you.
July 7th.
Correct.
You said June. That's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, July 7th would be necessary. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Not seeing any objections there. I want to thank everybody. I thought the meeting went fairly smoothly, even though this chair was a little tired this morning and maybe missed a public comment or two. But anyway, thank you all. Thanks for the member of the public, Mr. Green, who did call in. Our next meeting will be the first week of July. With that, I want to thank all of us, Christina Perry, Steve Moss, Brad Davis, Hillary Blackerby, and Pablo, who basically helps make this thing happen. Greases the skids in that regard. Thank you all for putting the meeting together. The meeting is adjourned unless I hear otherwise. We stand adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Paula. Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye.